for our next paper session, our first presentation is going to be by Kimberly Rogers. She's presenting her work, Major Reactions to Minor Events, a Bayesian approach to identity disruption. And this is co-authored with Doan. This is part 2 of yesterday's talk. So I'm excited to learn more about green school.
Thank you so much. So there are a couple of things I want to say up front. One is that this is the first time I'm doing this talk, so please let me know how I'm doing on time, and hopefully I'll be able to keep it on time. The second is that just like the other project, we're really sort of just in the thick of analyzing these data and figuring out the framing for the paper. So we'd be very interested in hearing feedback from you guys about what you think is interesting and exciting, what applications you see to broader sociology, and what type of framing we might be able to use, because we really like to communicate these findings to a general audience. So going back to the presentation from yesterday, we've really been interested in this research question about how the congruency of enacted identity meanings within and between people shapes deflection. And many aspects of this are a very classic question in ACT, but we found some sort of new elements of it can be explored with innovations in the discipline. So, so we're particularly interested in 3 things: how deflection is impacted by the simultaneous enactment of equally salient identities with very similar versus very different cultural meanings. So this is a multiple identity enactments question. We're interested in how it's impacted by whether or not the situation confirms versus disconfirms identity meanings for the actor, and whether or not the enacted identity meanings of the actor and the object person affect these types of findings. So specifically looking at interaction effects between these types of things. Going back to Rob's rhizome idea, I really think that this project is characterized very well by that for a number of reasons. So why now? Decades and decades of theorizing and empirical work about the implications of identity meanings for self and other, the fit between situated behavior in these meanings, about multiple identity enactments, all of these things for deflection were necessary for us to even begin thinking about things in the way that we'll present them today. So Dave's work, Lynn's Cooley need address, a lot of conversations that we've had about these things over the years were very important. The change in modeling capabilities with Bayesian. So this is the first time that we can formally model the implications of multiple simultaneous identity enactments and think about their relative salience and things like that using probability distributions. So that's something we're super excited about with this work. And then there's some work that I've been doing over the past couple of years, and some of this was around conversations we had at the last ACT conference about the complementary patterns of deference and submission that a lot of us were finding in our work. And it ties into the occupational study, it ties into the intersectionality work. But one of the things I had found is that when I asked people to rate social identities, there was sort of a mythical norm cluster, if anybody's familiar with Audre Lorde's work, that kept coming out in the studies that I was finding, where essentially people with who are prototypical on different dimensions of privilege have very, very similar EPA meanings in American culture. And so if you're a white, wealthy, Christian man who's cisgender and heterosexual, all of those identities mean really similar things in EPA space. And pretty much any other identity on those spectrums varies all over the place. So having any other 2 identities or any other identity in combination with any one of those means you carry 2 really different identities, EPA-wise. Whereas if you have consistently privileged identities, their meanings are much, much closer together. And so that was really interesting and exciting pattern to me. And doing some like old classic ACT simulations, I found some interesting stuff that got me excited about the possibility of working on this with Bayesian. And for those of you who were there at our ASA talk a couple of years ago, I guess it was, we did some illustrative simulations with Bayesian that precede the work I'm going to present today that showed something really interesting. That's while consistently privileged identity meanings are an asset in identity confirming situations, so you have much lower deflection in identity confirming interactions than folks who have diversity in social identities. Pattern is completely reversed in disconfirming interactions. That basically, having two very similar EPA meanings is a liability when the situation is disconfirming, because you don't have any recourse for reinterpreting the situation when things go awry, as far as things are conceptualized. So all of these things sort of crystallized into the work that I'm going to present to you today, which is a very large simulation experiment to flesh out some sort of theoretical propositions that we might be able to pick up and test in other work that are grounded in impression formation, properties from ACT, using Bayesian models. So why do a simulation experiment? These are fairly unusual in the larger discipline of sociology, but as those of us who do a lot of simulation experiments know, there's a good reason for starting here before we start to collect observational data. They allow us to look at a balanced examination of interaction structures with diverse properties, including really socially unlikely events, like those involving people that might be really unlikely to interact in the real world, like very privileged and very disadvantaged groups. And those involving behavior that doesn't conform with social norms, which is pretty much less likely than things that are very deflecting, like deferential behavior by the powerful and dominance by the powerless. We're also really excited about this idea of using this to kind of move into a quantitative space with Michael Schwalbe's idea of generic processes of inequality. So identifying things that occur in multiple contexts wherein social actors face similar or analogous problems. So removing the denotative meaning from social identities and thinking about the connotative meaning and how that shapes people's experiences. Okay. So we did a simulation experiment with Bayesian, a pretty large one. And in each simulation run, we were looking at 20 consecutive exchanges of behavior between two people, so turn taking, kind of more like a traditional ACT simulation. We did a lot of conditions, and in each one we initialized it uniquely 500 times, meaning that different identity combinations were being drawn in each simulation. And our focus for this study were primarily on the outputs associated with the actor's point of view on the situation, because in Bayesian you can model these things from multiple points of view. It was a 8x2 by 8x3 vectorial design. You guys will see what we did in a second. So we were interested in variation by octant. We wanted to see how these work with general properties of interactions, possibly maybe different types of interactions. So we varied the actor identity EPA across octant. So you randomly select octant and then randomly select identity within octant for each one of those 500 initializations. We looked at two levels of identity congruence. Either the meanings were virtually identical or they were opposite in EPA space, just as a starting point. And we looked at object identity EPA using the same sort of operationalization as actor identity. And then finally, the last three were behavioral confirmation of the actor's identity. So either the object's behavior was optimally confirming, moderately disconfirming, or highly disconfirming of the actor's identity meanings in the situation. You guys tracking with me so far? Yes.
How could you have two levels of actor identity congruence?
Oh, I got it.
Never mind.
Okay. So we did 192,000 simulation runs here, because 500 initializations by 384 conditions. And what we're focusing on right now are the major patterns, main effects, and interactions that relate to those core questions that I was telling you about. But we have a lot of future research that we want to do and are very interested in hearing more from you guys about what you would like to see come out of these data. For now, I would like to really pause and thank Jesse Hoey and his student Daniel Chorney, who helped us to automate the process of running these and pulling the data back out into a sociologist-friendly format so that we could actually analyze them after I came up with this crazy design. So many, many thanks to them. Much appreciated. Okay. So the data for the analysis I'm going to present today, our dependent variable is mean deflection, so associated with actors' impressions of the event, averaged across the 20 behavioral exchanges that I mentioned. The independent variables are dummy coded, just for simplicity of presentation. For actor and object meanings, we simplified from EPA octants to two categories, privileged and everybody else, based on that premise I was telling you about the high correlation in identities of privilege. We've tried 3 different operationalizations of privilege, and the findings I'm going to present to you today are robust to thinking about privilege as an E plus, P plus, A plus octant issue, something that just has to do with power, or something that has to do with combinations of E and P. The findings come out the same. Meaning congruency was categorical, with the reference category being incongruent. And for behavioral confirmation, I mentioned the 3 levels, but highly disconfirming was the reference category in these analyses. And I'm going to show you 4 regression models. Model 1 just shows you the main effects of each of our variables. Model 2 adds interactions between actor, meaning, congruency, and how confirming the situation was for those identities. Model 3 adds the interactions between actor and object person identity meanings. And model 4 adds the meaning congruency by actor and object identity meanings interactions. So 2- and 3-way interactions I'll present there. All right, so here you can see the main effects. One of the really interesting main effects was the direct effect of involvement of privileged people in these interactions on the overall deflection produced from the actor's point of view. Deflection is higher when privileged people are involved in the situation. That is a main effect. It's particularly higher when privileged objects are involved in the situation, but actors impact it too. And we think that the effect of object identity meanings, which I'll show you is persistent even with all these interaction effects added, has to do with the incompatibility of power, the high level of power in that octant, with the object diminishment effect that's represented in the impression formation equations. Basically, this means that powerful people don't like other people doing stuff to them. They like to do stuff to other people. They don't like to be the object of other people's behavior. We also found, probably unexpectedly, that deflection is higher, which is a main effect of behavioral disconfirmation. Deflection goes up when identities are disconfirmed. So model 2 adds the meaning congruency interactions to these things with the level of behavioral disconfirmation in the situation. One of the things you might notice here is that the direct effect of actor meaning congruency becomes insignificant in our models when we add these interaction effects, but that they also become insignificant. So in model 3, we add the interaction between the actor identity meanings and the object identity meanings. Here we see a negative interaction term that basically shows that there is an overall effect that is negative of interacting with privileged object persons, but that effect is about half the magnitude for privileged actors when they're having an in-group interaction with another privileged person compared to a disadvantaged actor interacting with the same type of object, if that makes sense. So it's always worse to interact with a privileged actor in terms of average deflection, but that is buffered by the in-group advantage of also being a privileged person yourself. Okay, lastly, we added the 2- and 3-way interactions between meaning congruency and actor object identity meanings. And here you see that the direct effect of actor identity meanings drops out of significance, and I'll show you the graph for the plot for this one again in a minute. We see that there is a significant effect of 2 of these 3 interactions, of the interaction between actor meaning congruency and actor identity meanings, and of the 3-way interaction. And basically what we find here, so in effect, because of how we've operationalized meaning incongruency in this study, if you're a privileged person who has incongruent identities, you look very functionally similar to a disadvantaged person who has incongruent identities, right? Because you have 2 EPA opposing identities. So one of the reasons that with this operationalization of privilege we're using here, without breaking it down a little bit smaller, we don't see significant differences between incongruent actors based on their the actor's identity meanings. But when we're looking at consistently privileged actors versus consistently disadvantaged actors, we see like an additional, an additional underscoring of the finding that I mentioned before about the in-group, out-group effects of interacting with privileged object persons. One thing I want to highlight is to go back to a three-way interaction that was not significant in our models, which is that I went into this based on the findings, I don't know about you, based on the findings that we had from the illustrative simulations we presented at ASA, that we were going to find this paradoxical, you know, privilege is good and bad under different interactional circumstances. And we had gotten really excited because, you know, this is fragile masculinities. This is about why we're seeing mental health paradoxes and all of these different, the agency paradox, the immigrant, the race paradox. You know, maybe this is what's happening for people. Maybe this is about the status loss that people are experiencing with the current political transition, right? And one of the things that I think is still like a really promising avenue for us to unpack in this data by like unpacking actor identities and thinking more carefully about what's happening within some of the opt-ins is the fact that when you look at the three-way interaction between actor EPA, actor meaning congruency, and level of behavioral disconfirmation, there's really only two opt-ins where these things pull apart seriously, and it's only in highly disconfirming situations, which goes back to the point about deflection being a curve, right? That a curvilinear effect, that highly disconfirming situations have much higher deflection than moderately disconfirming situations. So for high E, high P, high A actors, which are the ones we use as our privileged category in this, and for low, high, high, so bad, powerful, agentic actors, we see these huge gaps where congruent situations are producing much higher deflection for them than they are for folks that have more diversity in their EPA meetings. And as I said, this is not something we see at all at the moderate and optimal levels. So really interesting to me. Definitely patterns we're going to be exploring more as we play around with the data. So that's where we're at with this right now. Our sort of major takeaway is that the congruency of enacted identity meanings within and between people does have important meanings, consequences for deflection. Specifically, deflection is higher when consistently privileged actors interact with non-privileged objects, when consistently non-privileged actors interact with privileged objects, when actors with incongruent identity meanings interact with privileged objects, frankly, when any actor interacts with privileged objects, and when any actor has their identity confirmed by the object, right? Some of these are things that we already pretty much knew. Some of these are new wrinkles that I think are really interesting for us to explore further. So one of the really cool things about this, and I've found this in some other different data sets, different topics, this goes back to that rhizome thing, this affective mechanism of inequality that sort of functions to keep privileged people away from everybody else, right? So I did a different paper where I found emotional consequences. Basically, everybody feels worse when they interact with privileged people, including other privileged people, but it gets worse, right? The more of an outgroup you're dealing with. So that's something really important for us to consider. Something else that we found was really important was that consistently privileged actors arguably have more agency in shaping their deflection outcomes when they're in between group interactions from their point of view. This is the actor's point of view of the situation, because they can maybe call on perceived disadvantaged identities to even the odds. And maybe this has to do with the person identities that we were talking about, or I was just talking so long at lunch about, you know, it's be like white women being like, oh, I understand disadvantage because I'm a woman, you know. Well, it's true, but that's like, you know, is that necessarily the same perception that the object person in a situation might have what the actor is seeing, right? So the next steps that we're hoping to take are to compare actors' impressions of the events to objects' impressions of the events in these data. To play around more with our operationalization of privilege. So we do find that these findings are robust across the 3 specifications that we've tried so far. But we do want to kind of like explode these octants and figure out what's happening when we're pulling specific identity initializations out. And as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, thank you, how to frame these ideas so that we can share them most effectively with the general audience. I think that's particularly tricky when you're dealing with these highly theoretical simulation experiments. So we really appreciate any feedback that you have about that. Thank you.
So we have time for questions. And I'm looking around, I say,
Lisa, is that right?
So I really liked Dana's work. I thought that the point you made at the end was like a really nice one about why these high status actors really don't want to be involved in, working with these other, be involved in any way with anything that causes these high reflections like immigrants or,
Yeah.
really distancing perspective. And just sort of from my perspective, it really harkens me back to the self-complexity work, like going back to Rule 1985 and Turner and all those people about the value of having complexity in our identities.
Absolutely.
And the buffering effect that gives us.
yeah, and we were thinking about that in the identity accumulation literature and how rarely people are thinking about the content of those identities in the ways that we do, right? Like the meanings those identities carry. So I think there's definitely something there. And that's something we're hoping to gather more, I think, through interview data, to, think about that a little bit more too.
Caitlin, you had a question.
Kind of a question and a comment. So you asked about how to frame this for, more of a general audience.
Yeah.
So, our people who use the algorithms quotes. I'm wondering, so there's a highly deflecting event in current events recently. If you saw, that doesn't have to do with 45, but the police officer who killed a man in his own apartment, and I don't know if you saw this, but his brother gave a very heartfelt impact statement, and was like, I forgive you, I want the best for you, I don't even want you to go to jail, and he hugged her. He please let me hug her. And I was just thinking about these incongruencies. He's a Black man, he's a victim, he's a Christian. She is a white, powerful, police officer, woman. People can't make sense of this whole situation. And it was like, if you were following it at all on social media, it was very divisive. Imagine reasons you would imagine. But I was like, what was going on in this situation that was so deflecting that hugging that person is the only thing that worked for him? Obviously, that's a complex example, but at first I was really struggling with somebody. So I think
It's very abstract right now. So.
Yeah, I don't know if that's even fits exactly that jump you were talking about.
Yeah.
But looking at big media events, and of course they're here and they're gone. But that is a specific example that just popped up. Does that fit like that?
I think, and one of the things we were thinking about doing, we don't really know what those cases will be, but would be to pull out sort of illustrative simulations and talk through a specific example. And then this is sort of how we did the Bayesian paper, and then show a systematic test that this is in fact an illustration of something that exists more broadly in the larger set of simulations that we.
Because that's kind of what I needed in the presentation. I need one example of the actual identities and behaviors, and then it would be easier.
And I think we're not there yet with the data, but that's the direction that we're heading in.
Lots of hands. I'll go to you first, Lynn.
Okay. So I'm now thinking occupations all the time. And so it really strikes me that your 2 conditions under which there was a big difference between the congruent and incongruent identities. Well, the HHH building here on block modeling work that Emily's just recently done is, this group, this block of highly valued people, that professional, privileged people that are considered to be giving important things to society. And the LHH identities are the sort of powerful sanctioning professionals. Yeah, you basically.
It goes back to that E by P occupation thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking
Sorry,
that
I'm
might.
in the matrix of these
Yeah.
conferences.
So Kate always thinks about criminal justice possibilities, and these days I'm always thinking about occupational structure applications. But it's, you know, I think the implications of your results would be that that interact, you know, with that those people occupy these really central and important positions within our occupational structure, but that interacting with them or them interacting with us is likely to create some deflections.
Yeah, and one of the things I found in my other paper that will be interesting to explore further is how much heterogeneity exists in those two categories.
Mm-hmm.
Like the fact that we're finding this overwhelming effect using the whole occupants is like kind of blows me away, honestly, because when I was doing the work I mentioned that identified the privilege cluster, it was differentiated from several other groups that all fall into these two parts of the space. And I didn't think that they would be the isolate parts of the space where this particular effect was happening, but like this is why it's helpful to do systematic simulations, right? These are the identities that we have like overrepresented a lot of times in our dictionaries too. So they're things people encounter a lot. They're easy for us to think of, but there's a lot of heterogeneity. And so like there were some really interesting cases that pulled apart in really important ways in my past work between people that had perceived levels of potency that were higher than many other groups that weren't privileged, but were almost threatening to highly privileged. So like African, lesbian, like there's a few identities like person of color, saying it that way instead of saying black. There's a few things that had this like connotations in talking to the folks that were doing the study of activism and like doing a thing, you know. And one of the most interesting reasons that the particular contentious relationship between them and the privileged groups came out was because that of the difference not only in P but in E and A, what was happening was that the groups that were threatening in potency were called to act more nice in order to not disrupt the identities of the privileged people, which is exactly what we see in so much group process literature. And it was driven completely by the fact that they had higher E and A than privileged groups, but lower P. So it was this like these interlocking V's kind of thing. Anyway, so like there's a lot here that I think thinking more with Bayesian along the lines of how we can, start to explore. And this is equally salient identities, right? We also didn't play around with that aspect. We don't have selves in this model yet. So I think like this is a very long-term, a start to a very long-term objective. And again, anybody that's interested in this, I would encourage you to take a crack at it because there's a lot of fodder there for theory building, in my opinion.
So I saw we have 1 minute left, and I know both Amy and Wolfgang had their hands up before Lynn. So
I just want to say I was struck by your finding that the privileged actors generate deflection when they interact with disadvantaged people and other privileged people. So is there a scenario where they're not generating deflection in your data? I mean, I think that would be something readers would be interested in. Thinking about how to pitch it. I mean, did you play around with it enough to find out when they can reduce the deflection?
I don't think they do.
They don't ever.
It's the object person effect. It's that,
and since all of your objects are either privileged
the
or
object diminishment effect really fight with each other. And it's just they don't like being acted upon. It doesn't matter what kind of interaction they're in. They are agents in their own lives, and being targeted of somebody else's behavior is not a good thing for them.
That's why you can only talk to the judge if he asks you.
Right.
Yeah, that was a really clear, that effect was in the last model more strongly slightly than it was in the first model after you saw the interaction person.
So did you try to relate your quantitative results to the interviews, to each single interviews which Long reported yesterday?
So that's a great question. So Not yet. And I probably should have put this in future research, but I am crazy enough to have made them fill out EPA scales at the end of these interviews for all the identities they talked about. So I'm planning on creating little little self-plots and trying to see. So, I mean, because the goal, literally, we thought the more Bayesian our work gets, the more we need qualitative research, and experiments just can't do some of this stuff as well in representing variation. And it's interesting, right, how compatible highly qualitative work becomes with Bayesian. I never would have thought I would be up here saying this, but like this is where I was like, okay, I guess I'm an in-depth interviewer now. Like, and all the stuff with Alzheimer's, right? It's a great illustration of that. Like the really thorny problems can be oddly solved by things that are, you know, not as methodologically opposite as you could imagine. But that was those quantitative data were the link for us between the formal link between the interviews and what we're doing with this.
That's gonna be a book.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, Kimberly.